Okay, we'll get started. Nice to see all of you. Listen, it's quality, not quantity.
Absolutely.
It's quality, not quantity. And we've got thousands and thousands watching on Zoom. So, okay, good morning. Nice to see all of you. Yesterday, of course, was Asara B'Tevet, the fast of the 10th of Tevet, one of our four fasts, which, as you all know, the prophet Zechariah, the Navi Zechariah in the 8th chapter of Zechariah, prophesizes that the four fasts will eventually be turned into feasts. They'll be for the house of Yehudah, for the Jewish people, l'sason, l'simcha, u'lemoadim tovim. There'll be days of joy and gladness and festivals. But when will that happen? When will these days be transformed into festive days, into days of joy and gladness? When will this prophecy of Zechariah come to fruition? And really, what are the requirements to transform these days from fasts into feasts or into festivals? And this is a question that's been raised at different points throughout Jewish history, most notably and of interest to us in this series that we call Medina and Halacha, with the return of the Jewish people in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries to the land of Israel. And with the Hakamat HaMedina that followed, the establishment of the state of Israel, this very question was asked. Are these fasts still relevant? These fasts, of course, are connected with the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. They're connected with the long, bitter exile. But here, now that we've returned to our ancestral homeland, leading poskim, leading authorities discussed and debated the relevance of the four fasts in light of the return of the Jewish people to their land, in light of the establishment of the state of Israel. And while the notion of somehow nullifying the four fasts may sound at first glance shocking, right? It sounds like what, Shabtai Tzvi tried to do, right? When he transformed Tisha B'Av from a fast into a feast. That's exactly what he said. We have experienced redemption. So the notion sounds shocking. And, more recently, the conservative and reform movement have written tshuvot, where they've discussed the relevance of the four fasts and Tisha B'Av, or the Tisha B'Av and the three minor fasts, let's call them, in light of the state of Israel. So for lack of a better term, to an Orthodox ear, this sounds shocking, right? But as we'll see this morning, there were leading poskim, poskei zmanenu, great authorities who debated whether these fasts are still relevant nowadays in light of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and in light of the founding of the state of Israel. And this question, while, as I said, it sounds shocking. What, you're not going to fast on the four fasts? The first time it was asked, it's not a new question, right? It was already asked in the days of Zechariah. And the prophecy that I mentioned in my introduction is really a response to a question that's asked in the 7th chapter. If you take a look at source number 1, okay, Zechariah, Perek Zayin, the beginning of the 7th chapter of Zechariah, there were individuals, Rashi calls them Anashim Tzadikim, there were righteous individuals. We're not talking about, reform or, non-observant Jews who didn't want to fast. No, we're talking about, from Yidden, Anashim Tzadikim, who sent a message from Bavel, from Babylonia, to Eretz Yisrael, to the Kohanim. Okay, this is already following the Babylonian exile. Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the three last prophets. They ascended with the Jewish people from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. And so Zechariah records how there were these individuals who asked of the Kohanim and of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, where I've bolded the passage that I bolded. Ha'efke b'chodesh hachamishi, should we cry and mourn in the 5th month? Right? What is that a reference to? The 5th month? What's the 5th month? Assuming we start counting from Nisan, which month is the 5th month? Av. If you count from Nisan, Nisan is the first of our months, right? So the 5th month would be Av. So it's a reference to Tisha B'Av. Should I cry and weep in the 5th month? Hinazer ka'asher asiti ze kama shanim. And abstain. Hinazer, abstain, like a nazir, right? Same root. Should I abstain from all those physical pleasures, right? On Tisha B'Av, we abstain from the 5 Inuim, which we observe as on Yom Kippur as well, are observed on Tisha B'Av. Should I weep in the 5th month, and should I abstain from all sorts of things, eating, drinking, etc.? Asiti ze kama shanim, just as I had done for many years, meaning while the temple was not standing, while the Jewish people were still in exile. They wanted to know what we should do during the Second Commonwealth, as the Second Temple was being rebuilt, was in the stages of being rebuilt. We know it took a long time. We know the prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they're telling the Jewish people to finish the job, okay? And here you have individuals from Babel who inquire of the Kohanim and Nevi'im in Eretz Israel, what should we do? Should we continue to observe Tisha B'Av now that we're no longer in exile, now that we've returned to our land and the Second Temple is in the process of being rebuilt? Okay? The temple in Jerusalem is being rebuilt. Should we abstain? And so the answer is found in the next chapter, in Zechariah Perek Chet. And this is a pasuk that we're all familiar with. I alluded to it in the beginning of this year. Source number 3. Ko amar Hashem tzvakot. This is what Hashem said. So Zechariah gives them the answer in the next perek. Right? He made them wait a perek. Tzom harivi'i v'tzom hachamishi. The fast of the 4th and the fast of the 5th. What are we talking about? What's the fast of the 4th month? Shiva Ser B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. The fast of the 5th month, we said, is Tisha B'Av. V'tzom hashvi'i, the fast of the 7th month. What's that? Tzom Gedalia. That's a reference to Tzom Gedalia. These are the 4 fasts that are associated with the destruction of the temple and the exile. Right? Zechariah is not going to tell them that Yom Kippur is going to turn into a festival anytime soon. That's Min HaTov. Right? So Tzom HaShivi'i is the fast of Gedalia. V'Tzom HaAsiri, what is the fast of the 10th? Hint, hint, we observed it yesterday. That's Asara B'Tevet, right? Tevet is the 10th month if you count from Nisan. They will be for the house of Judah, for the Jewish people, as days of joy and gladness and festivals. V'ha'emet v'ha'shalom ehavu. Interesting, the verse ends with these 3 words where the Navi instructs the Jewish people to pursue truth and peace, or love truth and peace. Now, what does that mean? Right? Mahakesher. What is the intent of those 3 words? Why does he end the pasuk, the verse, with those 3 words? We'll come back to that. Maybe that is important. Maybe that does have some impact on when these days, these fasts will be transformed into festivals for the Jewish people. Now, based on this pasuk in Zechariah Perek Chet, we have a fascinating discussion in the Talmud. The Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, on Daf Yud Chet, talks about 6 points during the year when messengers would go forth from Jerusalem informing people when Rosh Chodesh was, in order that they instruct them as to the holidays that are to be observed in that month. So, Al Nisan mipnei HaPesach. They would go at the beginning of Nisan so that people would know when to observe Pesach. Okay. Al Av mipnei HaTa'anit. At the beginning of the month of Av, because of the fast. This is a reference, of course, to Tisha B'Av. Al Elul mipnei Rosh Hashanah, beginning of Elul because of Rosh Hashanah. They couldn't go out in Tishrei, that would be too late. So they had to go out in Elul, because right, Rosh Hashanah is at the beginning of the month. Okay, etc., etc., etc. And the Gemara asks, well, why does the Mishnah there not mention Tammuz and Tevet, right? The Gemara asks, why don't they send messengers at the beginning of Tammuz to inform people about the 17th of Tammuz? And why don't they send messengers out at the beginning of Tevet to inform people about Asara B'Tevet, the fast that we observed yesterday? And the answer is because there are times when those fasts may not be applicable or may only be optional. Okay, and there are a lot of different ways to understand the Mishnah and the Gemara here, which l'chorah, at first glance, would appear to be a very simple or simplistic sugya, but it's actually very complex. So just to summarize, the Gemara continues and quotes the pasuk that we just read from Zechariah Perek Chet, that these fasts will eventually turn into festivals. They'll be for the house of Yehuda as days of Sason and Simcha, Moadim Tovim. They'll be proclaimed festivals. And the Gemara notes that they're called both fasts and festivals, right? So which one is it? It's interesting the way the pasuk is formulated. For the Gemara, it's troubling. They're both called fast. It's called Tzom HaRivi'it, Tzom HaChamishit, Tzom HaShvi'it, Tzom HaAsiri. They're referred to as both fasts, and then they're also referred to as festivals. So which one is it, right? And the answer is, it depends when. It depends on the political situation, perhaps. It depends on the spiritual situation. Bizman sheyesh shalom, yu l'sason l'simcha, ein shalom tzom. The first interpretation that the Gemara offers is, well, it depends. Is there peace? Isn't there peace? If there's peace, there'll be days of gladness. If there isn't peace, fasting. Right? Yes, peace, festivals. No peace, fasting. Well, but the question is, the underlying question is, how do we define peace? What is called peace? We'll see that for many, peace is defined by having a Beit HaMikdash standing. Okay? But let's see, because the Gemara offers other interpretations. So then we have Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, he comes along and says, when you have peace, there'll be days of sason l'simcha, right? There'll be days of gladness and joy. When there is shmad, now Rav Papa introduces another concept here. When there is shmad, when our religion is under attack, when there is a decree persecuting the Jewish people, threatening our religion, okay? Then tzom, then you fast. But then he has this gray area. Ein shmad ve'ein shalom. If there's no peace, right? Again, we still haven't defined what peace means. There's no peace, but there's also no shmad. There's no decree against our religion, preventing us from observing our religion, observing the Torah, observing the mitzvot. So then, Ratzu, Rav Papa says, if you want, mit anin, you can fast. Ratzu, but if you don't want to, ein mit anin. In other words, it becomes voluntary. It's voluntary. Okay? So then the Gemara asks, well, if that's so, if the fasts are voluntary, then why did that Mishnah say that messengers are sent out in advance of Av to inform people of the Rosh Chodesh so they know when to observe the fast of the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av? The Gemara asks, Ihachi Tisha B'Av Nami. Right? In other words, the Gemara is offering an explanation as to why there were no messengers sent at the outset of Tammuz and Tevet. And it would sound like, well, because maybe there's going to be a certain time when Tammuz and Tevet, the fasts that are found in Tammuz, the Shivasar B'Tammuz and Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, yesterday's fast, there are going to be times when those are no longer applicable, or maybe only voluntary, right? But yet the Mishnah mentioned Tisha B'Av. So the Gemara answers, no, Tisha B'Av is different. Amar Rav Papa, Shani Tisha B'Av. So Rav Papa, he defends his explanation, says, you know what, Tisha B'Av is different. Why? Hoil v'huchpulu bo sarot. This is actually an expression or a statement, a phrase that we invoked last week. On Tisha B'Av, we were talking about Tisha B'Av as the day when we mourn all of our national tragedies and all of our national calamities that took place throughout Jewish history. So Rav Papa says Tisha B'Av is different because huchpilu bo tzarot, many bad things happened on Tisha B'Av. A number of things, not just one thing. It's not a fast that marks just one thing, but it's a fast that marks many things. The Amar Mar, as the master said, this is the Mishnah towards the end of Masechet Ta'anit, where we have the Mishnah gives a list of 5 tragedies. So here the Gemara lists 3 of them, right, or 4 of them. The first and second temples were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. V'nilkida Beitar, which was the stronghold for the supporters of Bar Kokhba in Bar Kokhba's revolt against the Romans between 132 and 135 CE. The city of Beitar fell. V'nechrisha ha'ir, and the city was plowed over, or the Harabayit was plowed over. Okay, so these are just some of the tragedies that are mentioned in the Mishnah that took place on Tisha B'Av. And as we mentioned last week, throughout Jewish history, there have been a whole litany, a whole string of calamitous events that took place for the Jewish people on or around Tisha B'Av. So Rav Papa says Tisha B'Av, you can't touch Tisha B'Av. It remains. Okay, it remains, and until there would be, obviously, what he's saying, until there'd be a redemption. Although it's possible that Tisha B'Av would be observed even with the temple standing. We'll see that, according to the Rambam, Tisha B'Av was observed during the Second Temple period. Okay, it's fascinating. People don't realize. They think Tisha B'Av is solely based on the fact, well, if you have a temple, obviously you don't mourn on Tisha B'Av, you celebrate. Okay, so it could be that the qualifications are slightly different. It's not only about having a temple. It seems that there are other things that are introduced here. There's shalom, there's shmad. Okay, so shmad we can understand. What is shmad? Shmad is, as I said, there is a governmental decree preventing us from observing the Torah. We just celebrated Chanukah. So Chanukah was a gzeirat hashmad. If you look at the way the Rambam describes how the Greeks persecuted us, making certain decrees against observing mitzvot, studying Torah, etc., how they tried to destroy us spiritually. That's shmad. But what is this status when there is shalom, when there is not shalom? What does that mean? Right? So Rashi and many others seem to understand shalom as having a Beit HaMikdash. Right? Rashi, look where I've underlined source number 5. First he says, Bizman hazeh she'ein Beit HaMikdash kayam. Okay? He understands that the Gemara is talking about a time when there is no temple standing. And so therefore, when there is no temple, right, there is no shalom. And he defines shalom as she'ein yad hagoyim takifa al Yisrael. Then he goes ahead and defines shalom in a very simple way. When there is no persecution. The hand of the Gentiles are not persecuting the Jewish people. But there are others who define shalom slightly differently. Take a look at source number 6. This is the Rashba. The Rashba explains that shalom is Perush Bizman Sheyeh Shalom Sheyisrael Shruyin al Admatan. At a time when the Jewish people are what? Are living on their land. At a time when the Jewish people have returned to their land, and the way many understand the Rashba, at a time when there is Jewish sovereignty. Okay? But maybe even before there is complete Jewish sovereignty, maybe just at a time when the Jewish people have returned. And the Rashba is not alone. There are other Geonim and Rishonim who rule like the Rashba, that we're talking about Jewish sovereignty. That is ultimately the qualification. And what did Rav Papa say? When there is shalom, these days should be celebrated. Okay? When there is shmad, there is these days are fast days. But what if there's neither? Right? This gray area. There's neither shalom nor shmad. Then the 3 minor fasts, at the very least, are voluntary. The Gemara says, Ratsu mitanin, Ratsu ein mitanin. Now, the Gemara makes a distinction between what we call the 3 minor fasts, the 17th of Tammuz, the 10th of Tevet, Tzom Gedalia, and Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, the Gemara says, bad things, a lot of bad things happen on that day. So that day has its own status. Okay, and that's why the Mishnah mentions that messengers would go out in advance of Av and ignores or leaves out the other months in which the minor fasts fall out in. So you have the Rashba here, who again says that shalom is a Jewish presence, maybe Jewish sovereignty. And so you had, and as I said, others defined shalom in a similar way. You had poskim asking the question with the return of the Jewish people, with the Yishuv in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which we've been talking about over the last few weeks and months. You had poskim ask the question, should we observe these fasts? Should we observe the minor fasts? Okay, there is no Beit HaMikdash, but here we have maybe, according to the Rashba, Yisrael Shruyin Alad Matan. And if there is no, let's say there is no Beit HaMikdash, and we adopt the definition of Rashi, we'll see Rabbeinu Hananel and others. So even if there is no real Jewish sovereignty, even pre-state, but maybe these 3 minor fasts should be optional, because we're here, we're back, and there is no shmad. Jewish life under the Ottoman Empire here in the land of Israel was far from perfect, but I wouldn't say that there was a gzeirat shmad against the Jewish people at the time. Okay, and then following the founding of the state, you had poskim debate and discuss and ask the question: what about the 3 fasts with now the influx of the Jewish people and the establishment of the state? There's Jewish sovereignty. Certainly there's no shmad, and maybe there is shalom if we adopt the definition of the Rashba. That shalom requires Jewish sovereignty, and then maybe these fasts should be literally transformed into feasts, not only optional, but they should be mamish celebrated. Okay, that's what the Gemara says. When there is shalom, right? You l'sason l'simcha. So that's the question. Now, take a look at source number 7. The Rabbeinu Hananel there on the Gemara says, how does he define shalom? Klomar kol zman shebeit hamikdash kayam yeh l'sason l'simcha. Okay, he understands shalom to be synonymous with the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, but even still, even without shalom, so long as there is not shmad, right, the 3 minor fasts at least would seem to be voluntary. Okay, so take a look at his next statement where I've underlined next. He says, Ein shmad ve'ein shalom kigon ata bizman hazeh. This is when Rabbeinu Hananel is living. Rabbeinu Hananel writes that, nowadays, a number of centuries ago, Rabbeinu Hananel, Rishon. So in his day, he understands the Gemara to be saying that so long as there is not shmad, even without a Beit HaMikdash, the 3 minor fasts are voluntary. As the Gemara said, as Rav Papa taught, Ratsu mitanin, Ratsu ein mitanin. If you want to, you can fast. If you don't want to, you don't have to fast. Okay, it's pretty incredible. But take a look at source number 8. This is the Ramban. So the Ramban writes similarly. He understands shalom to mean that you need a Beit HaMikdash. That's the requirement. Peru sheyesh shalom hainu bizman shebeit HaMikdash kayam yula sason l'simcha. Okay. Now skip to where I've underlined next. Ve'achshav. Right. Then he says, okay, but if in the absence of shalom, so long as there's not shmad, So then the fasts become voluntary. But then he writes, "V'achshav kvar ratzu v'nahagu litanot b'hem v'kiblum aleihem." Oh, see, the Gemara says when there is no shalom, which Rabbeinu Hananel, the Ramban, and others define as a temple. So there is no temple. But as the Gemara said, so long as there's no shmad, the 3 minor fasts are voluntary. However, the Ramban and others say something else, that over time, we've accepted these fasts upon ourselves, so they are no longer voluntary. Maybe in the times of Rav Papa, they were voluntary. But the Ramban writes, "V'achshav kfar ratzu v'nahagu litanot behem v'kiblum aleihem." Okay, very, very important line. The top of the second page here. He says, the Jewish community, the Jewish people have already accepted upon themselves, observing these fasts, accepting them upon themselves. Lefichach, therefore, asur liyachid lifrotz gadran. It's prohibited for an individual to make a breach in the fence, to be poretz geder. What does that mean? Well, the Talmud says, even if there's no shalom, meaning, according to the Ramban, there is no Beit HaMikdash, but there's no shmad, there's no persecution, there's no decree, so it would seem that these fasts are voluntary. The Ramban says, no, we've accepted them upon ourselves, and that means they are no longer voluntary, and therefore an individual who says, I'm not going to fast, he is being poretz geder. The kol shekain b'dorot halalu, and all the more so in these generations, sharei ba'avanotenu she'rabu yesh shmad b'Yisrael ve'ein shalom. He says, you know what? Maybe all the more so nowadays in these generations where there is shmad. The Ramban is living in Spain at a time when there certainly was shmad. Okay, and there is shmad among Yisrael, among the Jews in the land of Israel. The ain shalom, and there is no peace, meaning there's no Beit HaMikdash, and there is shmad. So the Gemara says, when there is shmad, there is tzom. Hilkach, therefore, chayavin hakol litanot midivrei kabbalah v'takanat nevi'im. Therefore, everyone is required to fast midivrei kabbalah, from what we've received, what we've accepted, and from the enactment of the prophets. So according to the Ramban and many others, the fasts nowadays are no longer voluntary. They are obligatory since we've accepted these fasts upon ourselves. Okay, and we'll see that's how the Shulchan Aruch rules. First, take a look at the Rambam. It would seem that the Rambam says something similar here in source number 9. The Rambam writes, Yesh sham yamim shekol Yisrael mitanim behem mipnei hatzarot she'eru behem. There are days when all of Israel fasts because of the tragedies that took place on them, and then goes ahead to describe the 4 fasts. So by saying shekol Yisrael mitanim behem, it would seem to suggest that according to the Rambam as well, these days have been accepted. We've accepted these days of fasting upon ourselves. And then in Halacha Hey, right, where I've underlined, he says again, V'nagu kol Yisrael bizmanim elu lihitanot. Okay? All of Israel, again, observes these fasts, and which would seem to suggest that we've accepted these fasts upon ourselves. It's a lot of interesting diukim in the Rambam. Take a look at source number 12. This is the Rambam's Peru Shamishna. It says something interesting. Ubibayit sheni lo hayu mitanin lo asiri b'tevet below shiva asar b'tamuz ela harotze yitaneh o shelo yitaneh lefichach lo hayu yotzin al tevet v'al tamuz. He explains that this is in his commentary to the Mishnah that we began with. He explains that during the Second Temple period, that's when these fasts were voluntary. And that's kind of strange because we said that, if we define shalom as a temple standing, well, here's a temple. You have the Second Temple. Why are people fasting the 3 minor fasts while the Second Temple is standing? But it's voluntary. So that's how the Rambam understands our sugya. That's how he understands the Mishnah and the Gemara, that it was talking about the Second Temple period with the Second Temple standing. And at that time, the 3 minor fasts were voluntary. And then look where I've underlined next, skipping towards the bottom. And he explains that the fast of the 9th of Av was observed during the Second temple. So many try to reconcile that and how to understand that the way, in light of the way many understand that passage in the Talmud that we began with, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and Daf Yud Chet. In other words, it would sound like the Gemara is saying when there is peace and there is not Gzeirat Shmad, these three fasts no longer apply and should be celebrated. Okay? And if you have a temple standing, why do you observe Tisha B'Av? Okay, so again, it's a machloket as to how to read that Mishnah, how to read that Gemara. When is it talking about? Is it talking about when there's a temple standing? Is it talking about at another point in history? But in any case, some explain the Rambam. This is here. I'll just summarize it for the sake of time. But source number 14, the top of the next page, is a passage from Mesorah, which is a publication of the OU, or was a publication of the OU, which preserves the Torah. The Divrei Torah of Soloveitchik has a lot of beautiful, beautiful pearls in Mesorah magazine. So this comes from the 15th issue and describes how, according to Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, the Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, said over in the name of his father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, that the criteria is the end of the pasuk. And that's sort of the key in understanding the Rambam. The end of that pasuk in Zechariah, where the Navi says, "Va'emet ve'ashalom ahevu," right? That you should love and pursue truth and peace. Va'emet ve'ashalom ehavu. You should love and pursue peace and truth. Va'emet ve'ashalom ehavu. And he points out, take a look at the Rambam in Halacha Yutet, when the Rambam quotes this pasuk and discusses how, yes, in the future, these fasts will indeed be transformed into feasts, indeed be transformed into festivals. The Rambam quotes that whole pasuk, and then he quotes these three seemingly unnecessary words, ve'amed ve'ashalom ehavu, right? Where I've underlined in Halacha Yutet, source number 9. Why does the Rambam need to include those three words? The Rambam, when he quotes a verse, doesn't always quote the entirety of the verse. He often truncates a verse. Certainly if, the last part of the verse is seemingly irrelevant. Okay? So what Rav Moshe Soloveitchik explained was that, no, that's the criteria. Ha'emet ve'ashalom. That even if you have a temple standing, but there is no emet, there is no shalom, there is no truth, there is no peace, there's all sorts of corruption. We know that during the Second Temple period, there's a lot of corruption. We spoke about that before Chanukah. We spoke about the Chashmonaim. A lot of corruption during the Second Temple period. The Mishnah, the Gemara, in a number of places describes how many of the miracles that took place in the First Temple were absent in the Second Temple. A very different experience. And so maybe, according to the Rambam, yes, even with the temple standing, there was something lacking. And that's why they fasted Tisha B'Av during the Second Temple period. And that's why the three minor fasts, which should not have been observed at all, or really should have been observed as festivals during the Second Temple period. Because we said, when there is shalom, which many say shalom is defined as a temple standing. Well, here you have a temple standing. It's the Second Temple period. When there is shalom, the Gemara says, those days are Yamim Tovim. They're L'sason L'simcha L'moadim Tovim. They're festivals. They're not fasts. They're feasts. They're celebratory days. They're festivals. They're happy days, holidays. So it should have been celebrated. No. Why was the fast optional according to the Rambam? Yes, there was a temple standing, but there was no emet and shalom. And that also is a prerequisite. That also is a requirement to transform those fasts into festivals. If there is no emet, if there is no shalom, so then Tisha B'Av was observed during the Second Temple, even with the temple standing, and the three minor festivals were voluntary. Okay, that's how Rav Moshe Soloveitchik explained the Rambam. Okay. The Maharsha here in source number 13 says something similar. Yes. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the Maharsha. Let's take a look at the Maharsha. That's how some explain the Rambam. As I said, there are many different diukim in the Rambam here. Many different explanations of the Rambam. It's very difficult because why would you observe Tisha B'Av when you have a temple standing? That's what you're supposed to celebrate. And why would the minor fasts be voluntary when you have a temple standing, right? And there is shalom, and there is not shmad. So Rav Moshe Soloveitchik explains because there was no emet v'shalom. And the fact that the Rambam includes the entire verse, including those three seemingly unnecessary words, is to tell you, no, when there is no emet and shalom, you still have to fast. You still have to mourn. Okay, the three minor fasts were voluntary. So take a look. The Maharsha says something similar here in source number 13 towards the bottom. Right? It's only at a time when people emet v'shalom ehavu are in love with truth and peace, are pursuing truth and peace. Aval be'ein imchem emet v'shalom. If there is no truth and peace among you, tachzeru l'tzom, it will go back to fasting. Dahainu b'vayit sheni bizman hachurban, kemo shekatuv b'perek kama diyom habayit sheni shaya bo Torah u'gemilut chasadim mipnei ma charav. In the second temple, there was Torah, there was Milut Chasadim. So why was it destroyed? Because there was baseless hatred. So that's how the Maharsha also explains why they fasted on Tisha B'Av during the second temple period, and why the three minor fasts were voluntary, because there was no peace, there was no truth, there was no harmony, because there was Sinat Chinam, there was baseless hatred among the Jewish people. Okay. And that's how he explains. That's how, again, he explains the end of the verse, why the Navi Zachariah tacks on these three seemingly unnecessary words. Okay, it's a fascinating discussion. The next few sources deal more with Tisha B'Av. So for the sake of time, we won't explore them together this morning, but take a look at source number 17. This is a fascinating letter from Rav Kook, okay, which is printed in his collected letters, the Igrot HaRiyah, or Igrot HaRa'ayah, in the 4th volume, Chelek Daled. And as I mentioned at the outset, with the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, with the major influx of Jews, the first Yishuv, the second, the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, we've spoken about it at length the last few weeks and months in different contexts with regards to, establishing a state and the Chashmonaim and Chanukah, or with regards to Shemitah and the Heter Mechira. So there were those who saw, this renaissance, if you will, this return of the Jewish people to their land as the beginning of the process of redemption. Certainly, the Vilna Gaon, who sent his students, and you see from the writings of his many students, they saw their return to the land of Israel and the fact that they were rebuilding Jerusalem. They saw that as a sign that the redemption has begun, the Atchalta de Geula, the beginning of redemption, or the Ikveta de Meshicha, the footsteps, the heels. Sometimes it's called the heels of the Mashiach. Sometimes it's called the Pamonim, the footsteps of the Mashiach. And even pre-state, there were poskim who discussed and debated whether the 4 fasts should be observed, bisman hazeh. And one question, which was absolutely fascinating, was what about the 4 fasts in light of the appointment of Sir Herbert Samuel as the High Commissioner of Palestine? Okay. Now, Sir Herbert Samuel was a Jewish British politician. He was a member of Parliament. He was influential in the Balfour Declaration. He was influential in women's suffrage and getting women to be included in the Parliament in Britain. He did a lot of wonderful things. Unfortunately, when he was ultimately appointed the High Commissioner of Palestine. He ultimately made concessions to try and appease the Arabs. He slowed the Jewish immigration to Israel at the time, which was something that was not good. He appointed Hajj Amin al-Husseini, a known extremist, to be the mufti, if I'm pronouncing it right, the mufti of Yerushalayim, the same Hajj Amin al-Husseini who famously met with Hitler in Berlin in 1941. There's that famous picture of the two of them plotting against the Jews. So in the end, Herbert Samuel did not live up to the expectations and hopes many had for him. But he was involved. He was the first Jew to serve, or unconverted Jew to serve in a cabinet office, and was involved, as I said, in the Balfour Declaration. And with his appointment as High Commissioner, the first Jew in almost 2,000 years to govern the land of Israel, many Jews, including rabbis at the time, saw that as a major step in the ultimate redemption of the Jewish people. They even questioned whether they should accord him the status as king, Melech Yisrael. It sounds funny. I hear some people chuckling. Based on the faces here, the Partsufim, I see that you are surprised. But serious poskim, serious Talmidei Chachamim question whether they should accord him the status of the king, because here, after 2,000 years, you have an official leader, an official governor over the Jewish people in the land of Israel, who was Jewish, right? Of course, that's the first Jew to govern over the Jewish people in almost 2,000 years. And we've mentioned in the past this fascinating rabbinic personality, Rav Chaim Hershenson, who assisted Eliezer ben Yehuda in reviving the Hebrew language here. He had a lot of shilas. You have to ask someone who's fluent in rabbinic literature, someone who knows, rabbinic Hebrew for help. Ultimately, he was chased out of Israel by extremists and became the chief rabbi of, if you look in his Sfarim Malki Bakodesh, the chief rabbi of like Hudson County, Union City, Jersey City, Hoboken, Weehawken, all of these places near the Lincoln Tunnel, not too far from where I grew up in New Jersey. And he writes a series of tshuvot called Malki Bakodesh, where he describes how you could establish a democratic state, a democracy in the land of Israel. This, of course, is before the Hakamat HaMedinah, before the establishment of the state of Israel. He was very influenced by de Tocqueville. Okay, he loved democracy, and he questioned, do you need a king? The Torah says, Som tasim alecha melech. So he's a fascinating personality, and in his collected writings, in his commentary on Masechet Horayot deals with what happens when the Sanhedrin, the Beit Din HaGadol, makes a mistake. They have to bring a certain type of korban. What happens when the Melech Yisrael, the leader of Israel, the king of Israel, makes a mistake, does something, he has to bring a certain type of korban? They question, what happens if Herbert Samuel makes a mistake, right? Does something wrong? Is he considered Melech, a king over Israel, Melech B'Yisrael? I mean, it's an incredible question, but you see the way serious Talmidei Chachamim. And so he includes his letters back and forth concerning that. But with the appointment of Herbert Samuel in 1920 as High Commissioner of Pre-State Palestine, for some, this was a sign that redemption was imminent. Again, he was the first Jew to govern over the Jewish people in the land of Israel in almost 2,000 years. And they asked whether the 4 fasts should be observed nowadays with Herbert Samuel as the High Commissioner. I mean, Herbert Samuel, wasn't such a tzaddik, but he did good things. Ultimately, did some maybe not such good things at the end. Yeshu was ultimately disappointed in him, but at least at the beginning with his appointment. So they asked Rav Kook, and here in source 17, this is again a tshuva that is reproduced in the 4th chelek, the 4th volume of Igrot Haraya. Rav Kook responds, and take a look first at how he dates this tshuva, right? Bezrat Hashem Yom Yutet L'Chodesh Tammuz Tafresh Pei, right? Shnat Harishona, Right, so this is the 19th of Tammuz. So obviously they had asked him probably in advance of the 17th of Tammuz. This is literally right after he's appointed. Okay, this is July 1st, 1920. So this is like right after his appointment. So, but take a look at what Rav Kook writes next and how he dates the letter. Shana rishona la'achenu hanetziv ha'elyon shel Eretz Yisrael, Mar Eliezer ben Menachem Sir Herbert Samua. In the first year, Shana rishona, for our brother, the High Commissioner of the land of Israel. What is he alluding to here? In the first year, he's alluding to how documents were dated according to the year of the king, of the Melech Yisrael. Okay? So with that already, with the way he dates the letter, he's recognizing that something very special in terms of the ultimate redemption is taking place. Okay, so take a look at the bold down there. He says, Michtavo yakar kibalti, I've received your letter. Virgashot she shono b'tshuat Hashem asher ifli lasot imanu b'yisod gulatenu b'minuav ha'elyon shelachenu hasar gadol shlita meleat livavi simchat lev. He says, wow, feelings of regashot sono b'tshuat Hashem, feelings of happiness and gladness with the redemption, the salvation of God, who has chosen as part of the redemption to appoint Sir Herbert Samuel, Shlita, he writes. Right? It fills my heart with great joy. Mleat livavi simchat lev, my heart is filled with joy. And he continues how it is a real sign in the redemption. Biroti ki gam ziknei ador margishim v'chashim et or hayeshua. I see that the elders of the generation, the Talmidei Chachamim, who I mentioned, felt that this is part of the light of redemption, the light of salvation. They're sensing margishim v'chashim. They are feeling and sensing et or hayeshua. And this is a good sign. This is an auspicious sign. Rav Kook writes, an auspicious sign for the house of Israel and its redemption. Okay, it's resurrection, really. It's resurrection. And then writes, but nevertheless, concerning the four fasts, concerning the fasts, I think, until we see Hashem seating the house of God, his holy house, our Beit HaMikdash, that is destroyed before our eyes, Bahar Marom Harim, in the highest of high mountains, L'tiferet Le'inei Kol Amim, Efshar Lanu Levatel Otam. And until we see the Beit HaMikdash being restored to its place, its high place, and splendor in the eyes of all the nations, it's not possible for us to annul the fasts. He's not only referring to Tisha B'Av, but all of the fasts, all the four fasts. Just like we've seen, Baruch Hashem, the beginning of the salvation with the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, so too we should see, our eyes should be illuminated with seeing the salvation and return of the Beit HaMikdash, etc., with the coming of the Mashiach. But you see that Rav Kook was uncomfortable with observing these fasts as feasts, or even saying that these fasts are optional nowadays without a Beit HaMikdash. And that becomes the consensus of many other poskim. Now, with the founding of the State of Israel, this question would once again come to the fore. This question would be asked once again. And it's fascinating. You have telegrams, and we have this in the archives. There were telegrams that were sent to the chief rabbinate, sent to Rav Herzog, with the founding of the State of Israel from Jewish communities all over the world. Rabbi, or rabbis, should we observe Tisha B'Av and the other fasts now that we have a State of Israel, now that there is peace, now that there is not Shmad, now that there is Jewish sovereignty? Okay, you have communities, for instance, like Istanbul and Algiers. I've seen these telegrams reproduced, asking Rav Herzog, and if you think about it, when was the state of Israel declared? Hey ER, the 5th of ER, right? Not so long after Hey ER, what do you've got? You've got Tammuz, so you got Shavasar B'Tammuz, and then you've got Tisha B'Av. So they were sending telegrams. Rav Herzog, what should we do? And Rav Herzog felt, I don't believe I reproduced the letter here, but Rav Herzog, like Rav Kook, felt that ultimately Tisha B'Av and the other fasts are rooted in the Churban of the Beit HaMikdash. And so long as we do not have a Beit HaMikdash, so long as the temple is not standing, these fasts are applicable. These fasts are not null and void, neither Tisha B'Av nor the other fasts. Okay, this is Rav Herzog's response, and these telegrams that I mentioned are reproduced in Tchumen. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the rabbinic journal Tchumen. Comes out once a year. Wonderful, wonderful rabbinic journal. So in the 18th volume of Tchumen, you can find reproduced these telegrams and Rav Herzog's response. Others like here in source number 18, Rav Chaim David Halevi, who was a very important posek. He was the chief rabbi of Rishon LeZion and then later Tel Aviv. Okay, very important posek. He writes in his Asel Harav here in source number 18, again, asked about Tisha B'Av and the other fasts, and feels that without a Beit HaMikdash, without a Mashiach, even though, you could say, and actually this particular tshuva was written after the 6-day war. So, all the more so. Now you could ask, well, okay, maybe it's not enough to have a state, but now harabayit biyadenu. So he adds, even though, yes, maybe harabayit biyadenu, although you could maybe punctuate that statement with a question mark. He says, no, even though it's so ironic, we have the Temple Mount, but nevertheless, Sholim Hilchuvo, foxes trespass upon it, alluding to the verse in Eicha, and that Gemara about Rabbi Akiva at the end of Makot. You've got foxes trespassing on it, even though while, yes, we see the beginning of the redemption with the founding of the state of Israel and with the 6-day war, the miracles of the 6-day war, the wonders and miracles, and we have a Temple Mount, but it's not really ours. There are foxes that trespass on it. It's not really in our hands. We cannot perform the avodah there, and so he writes the fasts are very much applicable, and that's how Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kohen Kook paskined as well following the 6-day war. And here in source number 19, this is a passage from Rav Tzvi Yehuda from Yom Yerushalayim Taf Shin Chaf Chet. So that was that first Yom Yerushalayim, and I'm sorry. Right, Al Tishkach, right? So he says something very similar. He says, "Aval b'tzomot shenitztavinu al yidei hanevim ein yad shechola lagat." No hand could touch these 4 fasts that were commanded by the prophets, because he admits, while yes, true, we find ourselves in the historic process of the redemption, but nevertheless, we are still pained with the pain of the destruction of the Holy Temple. Maybe all the more so when you look up and we're so close, but we're so far, right? And similar sentiments expressed by Rav Yaakov Ariel here in source number 20 in his Be'olo Shel Torah. Rav Yaakov Ariel was very important posek. He is the Rav for many years of Ramat Gan and the Yeshivat Hesder, Rosh Yeshiva, the Yeshivat Hesder in Ramat Gan, very major contemporary posek. So he also ruled that we can't make any changes. A slightly different hue. He adds that we don't have an authoritative Beit Din over Am Yisrael. Says, in order to even suggest that the 3 minor fasts are no longer applicable, you would need a Beit Din Hagadol. You need an authoritative Beit Din. You need a Sanhedrin. We don't have that. And also he says we don't have true peace. He looks at the security situation, the spiritual situation, the spiritual state of Israel, and writes that, therefore, based on where we are now, given the current situation, yes, while we are involved in this incredible, historic process of redemption, Yes, but it comes in stages. Like the Yerushalmi says, Kim'a Kim'a, like the sun rises, slowly, slowly, la'at la'at. Right? And so while we've returned to the land of Israel and we've been fortunate to declare a state, and we even reclaim the Temple Mount and Yerushalayim, we're so close yet still so far. And take a look, he writes, at just the spiritual state of the state of Israel. And that's something that you see echoed by many contemporary poskim concerning things with regards to, let's say, Hallel. According to some, this is the opinion of Rav Ovadia Yosef, Hallel with a bracha, at least. He writes, you can say Hallel on Yom HaTzut, but not with a bracha, because of the spiritual state of the state of Israel nowadays. We're far from being there yet. We're so close yet so far. And that's something for us to consider. At the very bottom of the page, source number 21, I put a little excerpt from an address that Rav Soloveitchik had given, which appears on the Yeshivat Har Etzion website. And there he's discussing really Tisha B'Av and addressing this question that some of the poskim asked. Some of the poskim here in Eretz Yisrael asked, following the founding of the state of Israel, and then once again with the reclamation of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in 1967, should we observe Tisha B'Av? Is Tisha B'Av still applicable in light of all that we saw this morning? And so he writes the following: does Yom HaAtzmaut answer the question of Eicha? Only fools can think so, arrogant fools, and there are many fools of that sort. Just as an aside, Rav Soloveitchik was certainly a religious Zionist, but his religious Zionism was tempered. Right? He didn't believe in an extreme religious Zionism. He was very pragmatic. You'd call him maybe a pragmatic religious Zionist. Okay. Can a Jewish government or military success be considered a substitute for all the suffering and killing of the years of Israel's exile? It is forbidden to say that this is the recompense for 6 million Jews who were slaughtered. This is an expression of cruelty and a total lack of sensitivity. Does the rejoicing of the 6-day war answer all the questions that arose in the period that preceded it? Are we not as puzzled and confused as we had been before it? Did this triumph lessen our sorrow and calm our spirit? Did it resolve our problems and doubts? Is it not incumbent upon us to repeat, as did Yirmiyahu, the question of Eicha? Right? Eicha is asked a number of times throughout Megillat Eicha, right? And for Rav Soloveitchik, it's up to us to ask that question. Eicha, how? How could such a thing happen? And for us to reflect. He continues, as long as God's will is as obscure as it was during the dark night of the hiding of his face, Hester Panim, as long as historical events have not been clarified from a comprehensive and true perspective, as long as the world mocks us because of our faith in a merciful and gracious God, as long as the mystery of Eicha has not found a solution, it is forbidden to abandon Tisha B'Av. And I would add, that according to Rav Soloveitchik, the 3 minor fasts as well. As long as a Jew asks Eicha, one must continue to fast on Tisha B'Av. Only after we succeed in deciphering the mystery of Eicha will we be able to abandon the fast of the 5th month. So Rav Soloveitchik is saying, like many other Poskei Zmanenu, we're not there yet. We're not there. We're so close yet so far. Mitzvah Hashem, Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, we will be one day Zoche to see the fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah, just like we already see the fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy in Perek Chet, in the 8th chapter, of older men and women sitting on their canes in the streets of Jerusalem, right? Some of them coming to the OU Center. I'm not calling anyone here old, chas v'shalom. But once again, we see old men and women in the streets of Jerusalem and children playing in her streets. Just like we've already been zoche, we've already merited to see the fulfillment of that prophecy, so too speedily we should be zoche to see the fulfillment of this prophecy, that these 4 fasts be transformed into feasts, into festivals for the Jewish people. Amen. Have a wonderful day, a great week. We'll see you, Amir Tzashem, next Wednesday.